Good morning. Yesterday, during the World War III Part A, we heard about domestic threats. Today, we turn our attention to foreign ones, and unfortunately, there's too much to talk about. For instance, Gorbachev said that it looks like the world is preparing for war. Petraeus says that the international system is under unprecedented attack from multiple directions, and Zabriskie says the global order is sliding into disarray. Carter's national security advisor also said that there is no international structure capable of handling threats that will occur almost simultaneously. And he's right. There is no capable international structure. But let's not forget, there is the United States of America, its friends, allies, and partners. But the U.S. is under assault from two large authoritarian states, its regime proxies, and non-state actors. And today we'll start with Russia. Ambassador Rooney, you served in Europe. You know the Russians well. Are they our friends or are they our foes?
Well, I think you know, in foreign policy, it's about defining your strategic interest, and not everybody's a friend all the time, and not everyone's a foe all the time. We have a situation now that after many years of tacit and implicit appeasement to to Premier or President Putin, that we have a doubly difficult challenge of reasserting the kind of strength that we asserted during the Reagan years vis-a-vis a guy that's particularly dangerous as a trained KGB agent and a fellow who's been responsible for a lot of problems, murders like Litvinenko and Yushchenko, the activities in the frozen conflict zones, which even started under President Bush. So we've got a big uphill climb to go to reassert American strength and get that relationship back in parity with Russia.
Okay. So in the Middle East, how do you see them? Are they our help or are they a disadvantage to us?
Well, I think if you read the News Czar, you'll see that President Putin has a personal preoccupation with radical Islamic terrorists, something that I think many of us have the same thing. His problem's Chechnya. And so his support of Syria to go after ISIS and al-Qaeda is logical from the pursuit of his national interest. Now, we align perhaps in pursuing ISIS and al-Qaeda, but we don't align with Syria itself and a lot of other areas where Russia's engaged in a less aligned manner with us. But the ultimate question concerning Syria is what's going to happen with Bashar and who would we replace him with?
Sebastian Gorka, Deputy Assistant to the President. He just mentioned ISIS. Oh, they love you out there. Where are we on the fight with ISIS?
Okay, so let's start with the last 8 years. We have to set the stage and understand what happened under the Obama administration. ISIS didn't exist a decade ago. 7 years ago, it was the Al-Qaeda in Iraq franchise. Today, it is the most significant jihadi organization for the last 90 years. It is the first jihadi organization to capture territory in multiple countries of multiple regions. Boko Haram, think about this, in Nigeria is a sworn part of ISIS and the Islamic State that was declared out of Mosul 2.5 years ago. They have money, they have capabilities, and most scary of all, just think about this. Let's take politics out of the equation, because politics was undermining national security assessment during the White House years of President Obama. Since the caliphate was declared in Mosul 2.5 years ago, we have killed or arrested 125 people in America linked to ISIS. That's not 25, not 35, 135. When Omar Mateen killed 49 Americans in the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, what did he stop to do halfway through? He put down his rifle, picked up the cell phone, and did what? Called 911, not to bring ambulances to the carnage at the club, but to swear allegiance to the Islamic State and Abu Bakr, things that the last administration's Attorney General tried to censor from the transcript of that call. Well, ISIS is serious. ISIS is the worst jihadi threat we have seen in almost a century. But on January 20th, 2017, at 12 o'clock, it all changed. And the president... We're going from 8 years of we're going to ameliorate the threat, we're going to degrade the threat, to how about this? We are going to eradicate ISIS.
Mike Waltz, you're a Special Forces commander. You've served in the Middle East.
I have.
How do you see the fight against ISIS and also Russia's role in this?
You know, I'll share with you a personal experience of mine out on the ground in Afghanistan. There's been a lot of discussion and a lot of hand-wringing, and rightly so, that we're 15 years into this war. It's our nation's longest war. A lot of folks don't realize, we don't remember necessarily that Vietnam was 10 years. In Afghanistan, where it all started, we're 15 years in and counting. And I can tell you, I was out on the ground when President Obama announced the surge in 2009. I was standing in my headquarters, and in the same speech, he announced its withdrawal. And an officer standing next to me said, "Sir," looked at me and said, "Can you imagine Franklin Delano Roosevelt, if you remember World War II, announcing D-Day and then telling the Germans we were leaving in the same time?" So I can tell you that, out on the ground, we immediately felt the effects of this notion of America's leaving, America's turning its back, and America's not going to lead in the world anymore. In my own experience, I had been working with an Afghan elder for the better part of a year. My teeth were brown. I had drinking so much tea with this man to build a relationship. And weeks after President Obama's announcement, he looked me in the eye and said, "Me, my tribe, and my 1,500 fighters that I wanted working with us, and not the bad guys, we can't support you anymore." And he said, "Take this message back to Washington." And I think this is illustrative of what we're dealing with now. He said, "Until you're prepared to commit your grandchildren, not your children, but your grandchildren, to stand shoulder to shoulder with my grandchildren and fight Islamic extremism, then you will never be successful here." So are we 15 years in? Yes. Are we in for a lot more fighting? And do we need a long-term strategy to undermine the ideology of Islamic extremism, just like we did fascism and just like we did communism? Yes, we do. Gordon, I think we're in for a long haul, and I think our nation's leadership needs to begin telling the American people, "I'm sorry, we don't have a choice. We are 15 years into what is going to be a multi-generational war because we're talking about defeating an idea." It's easy to bomb a tank, very difficult to defeat an idea, and that's exactly what we have to do.
Sebastian, let me come back to you. You heard Mike talk about a long-term strategy.
Yeah.
Will the Trump administration have one?
Oh, absolutely. Just read. One of the speeches that really wasn't adequately paid attention to was the president's campaign speech in Youngstown. If you read the Youngstown speech, you will see everything we need to do and the plan that we're going to execute. And I have to disagree mildly with my colleague, and especially with the gentleman who just shouted out from the audience, "It's impossible to defeat an idea." Wrong, sir.
Agree.
Wrong. We jettison the idea that this is a generational war. We will defeat ISIS and we will defeat them rapidly. To undermine the ideology will take a little bit longer, but not generations. Because remember one thing. In 1987, a man called Ronald Reagan stood in front of the Berlin Wall and he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." 18 months later, without a shot being fired, the people imprisoned on the other side of that wall took it down. Ideas can be defeated, especially bad ones.
Judy Jasser, American Islamic Forum for Democracy. There are ideas that we have, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. I think, listen, I'm the son of Syrian refugees who escaped Syria in the mid-60s. There is nothing more American than fighting theocracy. That's how our country was founded, and there are Muslims across the world that share our values, are against dictatorship, be it the secular military fascists and the monarchs, or the Islamist theocrats. Both sides of this fascist equation across the Organization of Islamic Cooperation are both the firefighters, but also the arsonists. And the only adults in the world is the West, is America, that was founded on the fight against theocracy. We have to stop racializing Islam. We are not, as the left wants to believe, an identity movement of one check-the-box minority. We're a diverse global population with ideas that span from fundamentalist to orthodox to liberal to secular. We need to start taking sides within the House of Islam, with the Green Revolution in Iran, with the secularists that are fighting for freedom against both the Assadists and the ISIS Islamists. Because the old 20th century bargain that the enemy of our enemy is our friend has produced this whack-a-mole program that has become, we could get rid of ISIS tomorrow or next year, and then in a couple years there'll be another radical Islamic group that'll come, unless we in the Muslim community, and that's what our Muslim reform movement is about, is we want to see this government. And finally, we have a president in the White House that's willing to identify Islamist extremism. So I hope we can shift the axis of the approach both domestically and abroad from this nebulous, blasé, countering violent extremism to countering violent Islamism. Because in the land of the free, we have to stop the blasphemy law invocation of this claim of Islamophobia and begin to engage Muslims that are jailed across the planet that try to fight against theocratic Islamism, which is the enemy, versus Muslims that want to be free and practice their faith free of oppression.
Yeah. Americans once were not bashful about talking about our ideas. And as Sebastian mentions, there was a Ronald Reagan who was forthright, who was willing to talk. Unfortunately, that's not the case now. Ambassador Rooney, Putin, does he have ideas, or is he just somebody in pursuit of his own power? What is Russia?
Well, you know, Russia's smaller now than it was the time of Catherine the Great. I think Putin made it clear when he first came in that he wanted to recreate the greater Slavic hegemony that is a big part of every Russian's mindset, and he seemed to be moving forward in that respect with the moves that he's made so far. It's up to us to project enough strength to counterbalance that historic the Kiever Rus, the Slavic strongman, which has dominated Russian hegemonic ambitions ever since Catherine the Great.
Yes, and it seems to me that essentially when Americans talk about their ideals, they are strong, because if we have any justification for operating abroad, it is because we stand for the things that people want. And clearly, when we start talking about the Islamic world, there is a lack of ideas. We don't seem to be fighting in that arena. We
really aren't. We're avoiding embracing groups on the ground. We want to do the lowest hanging fruit syndrome, which is to work with groups that identify as Islamic, when in fact that's how you identify Islamist movements, which are parties that embrace the collectivism of Islam as a faith, rather than, like we do in the conservative movement, believe in the separation of church and mosque and state. We believe in the individual rights of groups rather than leftist collectivist ideas. And that's why there's been this bargain between the left and Islamists, because they're both collectivists. We see this across the Middle East. So we need to, and I think we also, I want to put one point of caution about Russia, is we might share enemies with Russia against ISIS, etc. But make no mistake, our families are dodging ISIS. Russia is not bombing ISIS in Syria. They're bombing normal families, any type of anti-regime operations. Russia's working closely with Shia jihadists in Iran, as Assad is. So Assad is not the protector of secular minorities. He's working as a Shia jihadist with the Iranian regime and with Russia. So that's why we need American leadership to advocate for our ideas in the Middle East, which so far there's been a great vacuum. And make no mistake, one of the reasons the Syrian revolution has been radicalized is the opposition has been radicalized by the Saudis, Qataris, and Turks, who've not helped the secularists who share our values, but helped the Islamists. And that's one of the reasons ISIS came out of 2013.
Mike, when you were sitting...
I just had a question leading on to, how do we, there's a lot of discussion on working with Russia against ISIS, right? That we have common goals there. But at the same time, Russia's working side by side with Iran, their Shia militias, and Hezbollah. So how do we, on the one hand, hold Iran accountable for what I think is the worst diplomatic deal in modern American history, in the Iran deal, and enforce that, but at the same time drive a wedge with Russia and separate them from their allies and the Assad regime, right? So, I mean, do we, at the end of the day, do we end up fighting and working against both with our moderate allies, against both ISIS and the murderous Assad regime?
This is why we need a Trump doctrine, which I hope is about liberty. We have for too long, and as Condoleezza Rice said in Cairo, we for too long have sacrificed security at the expense of democracy in the guise of stability. This mirage of stability and that there's no kinetic war between governments has actually made us get in bed with regimes that are fueling the ideology. It's not only, we listen to this so-called, it's not a Muslim ban, it was basically 7 countries. I would add Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, governments that are fueling the ideas that are un-American. We should be putting on notice that we will vet people coming in and also groups that we support against Islamist ideas. So we have to be careful to have a long-term strategy, just like we did in the Cold War. We didn't get in bed with the Italian communists, the Cuban communists, say, oh, because they're anti-Soviet, we're going to work with those communist parties. That's our strategy right now when we work with the Saudis, the Pakistanis, etc., against the radical Islamists. We need to start having a long-term strategy, yes, short-term military one, but long-term ideological strategy for the promotion of freedom, because the Arab awakening proved that these populations are ready for revolutions, for grassroots movements against the establishment across the Middle East, which are these Islamic regimes.
Mike, when you were sitting down and having tea, what did Afghan leaders want?
Oh my, they want a better future for their children. They want the ability to have free markets, to make a living. I had an amazing experience standing next to an Afghan officer and actually an Arab officer from the United Arab Emirates. And he was talking to this group of Afghan mullahs, and he said, look what the United States did for Japan. Look what the United States did for Germany. Look what the United States did for Colombia, for the Philippines. And let's look at these growing Muslim societies in Dubai, in Jakarta, in Istanbul, although that's under a little bit of pressure right now, that there can be a better future for your children, for your grandchildren, and the way of the Taliban, of Al-Qaeda, and this Islamic, this bastardization of what is otherwise a peaceful religion is not the way. And that's exactly what they wanted. But in order for that to occur, for an economy to grow, for governance to improve, you have to have security. And that's the thing that the United States has provided since World War II in this global order that is now under so much pressure, and particularly under the Obama administration when we essentially turned our back on our leadership role around the world.
Sebastian, we've heard both Mike and Judy talk about what people in that region want. What can the Trump administration do?
Well, the first thing is to understand that we have to rebuild all the relationships that were broken in the last 8 years. I spent 6.5 years in the Defense Department teaching counterterrorism to our allies and our partners. And half of our students were actually Muslim officers from the Middle East and from elsewhere. Those nations that want to be on our side look at the last 8 years and they say, what happened? Aren't you the good guys? Why are you giving all this money to the mullahs in Iran? Why are you pulling out of Iraq, right? We stabilize Iraq, and then it's time to go home, and then what happens? ISIS happens. So what the Trump administration wants to do is to rebuild all those relations with those people who want to be our friends. And secondly, very clearly, the president has said again and again and again, we're not into invading other countries. That's un-American. We were founded as a nation to do what? Respond against imperialism. What's 1776 about? It's about individual liberty and freedom. It's not about imposing yourself on somebody else. So what we want to do is very simply this, Gordon. We want to help those people who want to be our friends to fight their wars for themselves. Yeah. They're on the front line. You remember that ISIS video of the fighter pilot in the cage? I like to tell people, look, this idea that we're at war with Islam, it's really fallacious, because what's the religion of the guy in the cage who was burnt alive? He's not a Baptist, he's not a Hindu, he's not an Episcopalian, he's a Jordanian who's being burnt alive as a Muslim. Why? Because he disagrees with ISIS. Well, guess what? It's the Jordanians, it's the Egyptians that we have to help defeat ISIS. With our advisors, right? The guys from Bragg,
like a good
with our
Green Beret.
trainers, right? But we have to help them win this war for themselves.
And if I could just add, I think it's very important that we not give American Muslims sort of a pass as sort of that minority group in America, because we can do things in this country to reform the very ideas that are theocratically inspiring the militants across the planet in this global jihad that you just can't do in Jordan or Saudi Arabia or Iran. So therefore, we need to tell and engage Muslims in America that feel an urgency, that care about the legacy of whether our children and grandchildren are going to be radicalized by this global jihad, and whether we want to leave behind an Islam that's at home with American ideas of constitutionalism and freedom, or whether it's at home with theocratic ideas. That's a battle that needs to be fought on the front lines on American media, university platforms.
I'm really glad you said that. You know, the war of ideas applies in the concept of peace through strength, just like military conflict. And to harken back to when Pope Benedict made his Regensburg address, where he spoke out more clearly and aggressively against radicalized Islamic terrorists than any elected official had, we saw a spate of moderate Muslim leaders, business people, and scholars come out all around the world and speak up and call for an interpretation of the Quran which is consistent with 21st century values, respect for life, and it's the same old thing. Weakness begets appeasement, which begets more conflict, and strength begets opportunity for good people to stand up. And whether it was the Jordan religious minister that came out and said, you can't fight an idea, we have to fight an idea with cultural diplomacy, or whether it's some of the people you're talking about, or the people that have written articles, we have to help find a new way to interpret Islam that's consistent with the modern world.
And there needs to be an intervention, I think, in our community about the conveyor belt from the nonviolent Islamist, supremacist sort of Islamic State identity movement to the militants. Right now, so many say, oh, let's just condemn terrorism and that makes them moderate. No, our Muslim reform movement has a one-page declaration that is a declaration of principles that 15 organizations sign that says, hold on, don't be deceived by Muslims who say, oh, we're just anti-terror. It's not about terrorism. Do they condemn the caliphate, violent jihad, believe in the equality of men and women, believe in secular values, believe in the Constitution? Those are the Muslims we need to hold accountable to be the leaders against the establishment of global Islamic states.
This point is really important. Let's just destroy for a second the Islamophobia charge, right? It's just the cheapest shot. When you don't want to argue the issues with us, then you're the racist, you're the xenophobe, you're the Islamophobe. Let's talk about values, because the bottom line is, if you don't believe in the US Constitution, I don't care if you're a member of the KKK, I don't care if you're a communist, or I don't care if you're a jihadi. You're a threat to all Americans. That's the bottom line.
So, Mike, the theme that we have heard, of course, is the failure of American leadership and the inability to really talk about these issues in a direct way, and that was clearly during the Obama administration. When you were in the Middle East, when you were looking and talking to people, there was support for this concept that the America had to be strong and indeed had to guarantee what they wanted.
Oh, sure. And again, just to break this down, kind of down at the village level where these things, this is where the rubber meets the road and where things are really being fought. The most angry Iraqi, the most angry Afghan that I came across wasn't angry because we were there. They were angry because they were risking their lives to work with us because they believed in a future partnered with the United States. They were angry because we were leaving. And our president had told the world, and President Obama, that we were leaving. And they said, look, if we're going to work with you, then we have to know that you're going to stand with us. And I think this notion of time is where we may have a little bit of disagreement. I have no doubt that under the Trump administration, we're going to see Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, either dead or in Guantanamo Bay. And I look forward to that day. But at the same time, and this is where we have to be honest with ourselves, they have 8-year-old kids, 6-year-old kids that are being brainwashed today. And my fear is that, you know, we've essentially lost that generation. And how do we turn that generation around? I think that's a 10, 20-year effort. I know that's not popular, or even longer. The other thing that I look at is look at our partnership with South Korea, with Japan, with Germany. We have been embedded with those militaries for 60, 70 years, and they are now, after multiple generations, after they go from lieutenant to captain to colonel, are able to stand on their own, and we're able to pull back and address other things. So folks, I think it's going to take a long time. I think we're going to knock ISIS in the rear end, but to kill this idea of Islamic extremism is going to take a long time, and the folks out on the ground know that. And I think we need to put a long-term strategy in place to deal with it today. What does that look like? You know, one of the things that I think it looks like is girls' education and women's empowerment. We need to move that. No society can oppress 50% of its population forever. And we need to move that from this kind of feel-good humanitarian place to a national security place. It is in our interest, in our national security interest, to make sure girls are educated and women are empowered, because where women thrive around the world, extremists do not. And that's, you know, a part of what a long-term strategy looks like.
And there's one. Let me add one thing to that. There was a man called Winston Churchill who said, "You don't go to war unless you define your victory conditions." And he's absolutely right. You don't put one man or woman in the battlefield in a uniform unless you know what it is you want to do. And we understand what we wish to do. And the definition of victory for us is a very simple one. I've said this again and again and again. We are going to make the black flag of jihad as repugnant around the world, not just here, but around the world, as repugnant as the black, white, and red swastika flag of the Third Reich. The brand of jihad has to be destroyed. And it's not just about Damascus, Raqqa, Cairo, the Sinai. It's Orlando, it's Boston, it's Chattanooga. Here in America, it has to be vilified and destroyed as a brand.
But if I can contextualize that a little bit, you know, we in the Muslim community also, in American policy long term, cannot be sort of deceived into thinking that ISIS comes out of thin air. The Saudi flag, the Iranian Islamic Republic, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, these are Islamic states that might be our allies against this monster that got created from their ideas, which is ISIS. But their ideology of the Islamic State is the oxygen for jihad. And until Muslims start to defeat this identity state of Islamism, Islamic State ideology, and that's why the long-term strategy has to be the resurrection of something like the U.S. Information Agency, where we start doing radio-free liberty into Saudi Arabia, into Iran, into Pakistan, in order to defeat those ideas and create civil society groups that begin to share ideas and win, like we did in the Cold War, without firing a bullet against the Soviets directly, but winning that by defeating. And by the way, in America, we see the invocation of blasphemy laws through using the term Islamophobia. We need to stop using that term. Islam is a diverse idea that doesn't have rights. Muslims have rights. We need to fight bigotry that exists against Muslims, but don't use the term Islamophobia, because they're trying to shut us all up from criticizing Islamic State ideology.
That's true.
Ambassador Rooney, you also serve in Congress from Florida. Is there Republican support for more money for Voice of America, for Radio Free Asia, all of those things that seem to atrophy under the Clinton administration when everyone thought, oh, we won the Cold War, we no longer need to have those voices for America?
No, I think there definitely is. Linking back to the comments about cultural diplomacy and you can't fight an idea, and as you mentioned there, you know, what happened with the fall of Eastern Europe, we're going to have to fight the war of ideas while people like the Colonel fight the war on the ground. And you can't do that without projecting your voice covertly and overtly. And I know that Congressman Rohrabacher, who heads up the subcommittee I'm on of Europe and emerging threats, used to be a speechwriter in the Reagan administration and was involved with Radio Free Europe. So he's totally in sync with that idea as well.
So, Mike, let me just switch gears for a moment, because I think you mentioned the Iran deal.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that that must have had an effect on the way people in the region viewed U.S. leadership.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, in one deal, our friends, folks that we have been fighting with, folks that are aligned with us, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Libya and across North Africa, saw the United States align with a Shia extremist theocratic state and begin pumping billions of dollars into it. One, just for a delay, not an elimination of their nuclear program, but essentially for a delay. And where is that money going? That money is turning right around and buying advanced Russian weaponry, missile defense systems, advanced fighters, all types of different advanced armaments, so that if they violate the deal years from now, how much harder of a time are our Israeli allied pilots and our own pilots going to have? I think it is an atrocious deal, and it sent the absolutely wrong signal to the region. And again, you feel that when the President of the United States speaks and sends these signals. We feel it out on the ground on the village level. You feel it when you're dealing with ministers of state. You feel it when you're dealing with civil society. I can't overstate, and this is a little bit of a nudge over here to my friend Sebastian, when the president speaks and says what America is going or not going to do, it makes either the military's job much, much easier or much, much more difficult. I can tell you in the last 8 years, in my own experience, having the President of the United States basically say withdraw, withdraw, withdraw was the mission, makes it incredibly hard to win out on the ground. So I'm looking forward to the next 4.
Sebastian, I think you've been nudged.
Look, I'll tell you a story from 2 weeks ago to tell you how, you know, there's a new commander-in-chief and how much he gets it and how much he loves our troops. There's something at Bragg called the Q course, qualification course, where you get your Green Beret afterwards. And before you graduate, those young future Special Forces officers come to DC to meet with various agencies and get briefings about how government works inside the Beltway. And they come and visit the NSC. 2 weeks ago, 18 future Green Berets came to my building, the Eisenhower building, across from the White House, to talk about, you know, what is the NSC. And I had a crazy idea thinking, we've got a new commander-in-chief. Wouldn't it be nice to get these young men who are going to go into theater imminently to meet the new boss? Not only did President Trump invite them to the West Wing to sit down with them, halfway through this meeting, made the schedulers go insane, he said, I'm not supposed to do this, come with me. He took all 18 of them into the Oval Office. He did a group photo behind the Resolute desk, and then just completely blew the day off. He said, this isn't good enough. All of you stand over there, and I want you one by one to stand next to me for an official portrait with me. That's how much he loves our military.
That's great.
And in the previous 8 years, those young men, and there was one woman, those young men wouldn't even have gotten into the West Wing. So you understand, there is a new commander-in-chief.
Sebastian, you first mentioned Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan taught us that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. But today, it looks even closer than that. Yesterday, in the panel, we talked about domestic threats. Now we've just talked about foreign ones. And I think that there is one conclusion I have heard today, and that is America must lead again. Thank you very much.
You bet.
All right.